On October 4th, 2020, the people of New Caledonia voted to remain a part of France in the second of 3 likely referendums on independence. Despite the results, support for independence on the archipelago does appear to be growing, with more than 46% in favor, up from 43% in 2018. And if at least a third of local legislatures requested, another referendum may be held in 2022, as provided for in the Ouvéa Accord, which helped end a deadly conflict between the indigenous Kanak and European peoples. But while the fighting may have stopped, the issue of independence, and by extent, national identity, very much continues to divide New Caledonia, one of the few remaining French-administered territories outside Europe itself. Located in the South Pacific between Australia and Fiji, New Caledonia's main island, today known as Grande Terre, was first sighted by British explorer Captain James Cook in September 1774 while searching for Terra Australis. He then spent roughly 10 days exploring the island and later named it New Caledonia because it reminded him of his father's native Scotland. Cook then sailed off without spotting the nearby Loyalty Islands. Rather, the captain of a British whaler, William Raven, is credited with their discovery in 1793, although evidence does seem to suggest they may have been sighted previously between 1789 and 1790. That, of course, is only half the story, and the earliest traces of human habitation on the archipelago date back to the Lapita culture, which existed from roughly 1600 to 500 BC. Named for a distinctive type of fired pottery discovered at an archaeological site in New Caledonia, the Lapita, who themselves may have originally come from what is now Taiwan, are thought to be the first settlers of Melanesia, much of Polynesia, and parts of Micronesia. These early settlers cultivated yam, taro, cassava, and other crops. The terraced fields they once worked are still visible in many places throughout New Caledonia. From the late 1700s until the mid-19th century, only sporadic contact with the archipelago was recorded. This soon changed with reports indicating the presence of sandalwood. Supplies of this valuable commodity had already been commercially exhausted in Fiji by 1813, and, following this, European traders began to hop from island to island. They arrived on New Caledonia in roughly 1840, and to meet growing labor demands employed a practice known as blackbirding. The term likely gets its name from slang, then used to describe various indigenous people from the South Pacific region, and essentially refers to the use of deception or the mass kidnapping of people to be used as indentured laborers, or slaves. In New Caledonia, blackbirding saw large-scale movement of people, mostly from the New Hebrides, modern-day Vanuatu, to Grande Terre, which increased considerably following a mining boom in 1873. All told, some 15,000 people were sent to New Caledonia for work in the plantation, mining, pastoral, service, and sailing industries. There was very little in terms of regulation, and children as young as 6 years old could be recruited on lengthy contracts of up to 12 years. If they received pay, it was less than half the rate given to adults. Approximately 33% of those brought to New Caledonia died there, with few of those who survived ever returning to their island of origin. Blackbirding occurred even on the fringes of what is considered Oceania, with a particularly egregious example being the Easter Island mass kidnapping of 1862-1863, when for a period of several months, Peruvian recruiters, as they were known, reportedly captured a total of 1,407 islanders. That's nearly 35% of the island's total estimated population at the time. Blackbirding continued well into the 20th century and only came to a definitive end with the start of World War II. Okay, so going back a little, French interest in New Caledonia began following the disappearance of Jean-François de Gallou-La Pérouse near the Solomon Islands in 1788. I probably butchered the pronunciation there. A rescue mission under Admiral Antoine Bruni d'Entrecasteaux left France in 1791, retracing the path taken by La Pérouse's expedition. Unfortunately, they did not stop to investigate a then uncharted island, modern Vanuatu, where it appears that some of La Pérouse's crew were still alive nearly 3 years after having become stranded there, but rather merely recorded it on their charts before sailing off. D'Entrecasteaux and company arrived on New Caledonia in 1793, where they explored the main island's northern half. Unlike Cook, who seems to have been well received by the locals, the French were not. One theory explaining this change in attitude being that Cook and his crew may have inadvertently introduced new diseases, thereby making the locals wary of another large group of Europeans. Regardless, Christian missionaries soon began to make their presence known in the archipelago, starting in the early 1840s, and following an order from Napoleon III, France took possession of most of present-day New Caledonia in 1853. But it was not until 1864 that the tricolor flew over the nearby Loyalty Islands. New Caledonia, aside from holding a strategic location between China, Australia, and the Americas, also seemed an ideal location for a new penal colony. French Guiana, over in South America, had served in this role since 1803, but given the prevalence of tropical diseases, harsh climate, and high mortality rate, it had earned an infamous reputation, especially among convicts, of whom fewer than 25% survived their sentences, depending on the particular location they were assigned. The first prison transport ships arrived at Port-de-France, present-day Nouméa, in 1864, and this continued until 1897. In total, France sent around 25,000 convicts to New Caledonia, the vast majority of whom were obligated to settle in the colony after having served a sentence of 8 years or more hard labor. Convicts were forced to participate in various public works projects throughout the colony, providing a steady stream of free labor. And, while their lives were never easy, it was considerably worse for those considered fourth-class inmates, who were often sent to the infamous Camp Brun, where conditions were so harsh it was nicknamed the Slaughterhouse. In 1871, some 4,300 political prisoners were sent to New Caledonia. These so-called communards were members and/or supporters of the short-lived Paris Commune, a radical revolutionary government set up in the French capital following the collapse of Napoleon III's regime in the aftermath of the Franco-Prussian War. Unlike other convicts, though, they were allowed to return to France, which most did, following a series of pardons granted in 1879. All that being said, establishing a colonial presence on New Caledonia never was an easy task. From the very beginning, French authorities and settlers had to deal with violent uprisings by the indigenous Kanak people, one of which, the Revolt of 1878, endangered the colony's very existence. The main issue here being land. From a French perspective, the Kanak, who in keeping with traditional agricultural practices left their land fallow for long periods of time, were slowing the colony's economic development, and therefore, a decree was enacted in 1855 to distinguish between occupied and vacant land. This in reality, though, saw large tracts of Kanak land actually under cultivation confiscated, which only increased following the discovery of nickel in 1864. A system of native reserves were then created ostensibly to protect indigenous land claims. In actuality, though, they led to even more problems as clans from one area were forced to live in the lands of another. Private land ownership in reservations was also done away with in favor of a collective model, which disregarded existing individual or family claims based on lineage. The anger of those dispossessed of their lands eventually came to a head in 1878, when a sizable and highly fertile holding was taken from Chief Atai for an extension of a penitentiary near the mouth of the Lapita River known as Fort Teremba. A number of soldiers inside the fort were killed by rebels, although it was never taken, and the revolt quickly spread, involving clans from Buluparas to Poya. It only came to an end several months later following a broad-range crackdown by the French military. In all, 200 French and 1,200 Kanak, including Chief Atai, were killed. Having already been betrayed from within his own ranks, Chief Atai suffered further indignity when his severed head was presented to French colonial officials. It was later transported to France, where a bronze casting of his face was made, and alongside his skull, it was displayed in various Parisian museums until, 135 years later, in 2014, his remains were repatriated to New Caledonia. Following the revolt, colonial authorities, among other things, set about enacting a native code. This was by no means unique to New Caledonia, and could be found in one form or another throughout much of the French Empire. In short, it created a separate legal status for indigenous people, which in 1887 became the basis for administrative law. It was followed by a head tax in 1899, which obliged Kanak men to find work, typically as laborers, either with settlers or the colonial government. The Kanak were also not allowed to leave the various native reserves on New Caledonia, unless otherwise granted permission to do so. From the 1890s onward, when the flow of convict labor stopped, colonial authorities began to actively encourage free settlers and foreign laborers. Most came from French Indochina, the Dutch East Indies, and Japan, although there was also a sizable number of immigrants from Vanuatu and the Solomon Islands. A smaller number of settlers included former members of the French administration or military, planters from Reunion, and settlers from Australia and New Zealand. In contrast, the Kanak population declined during this period, dropping from roughly 42,500 in 1887 to about 28,000 in 1901. The 20th century brought with it World War I and yet another Kanak revolt, when a number of villages rose up following the decision of their chiefs, under considerable pressure from colonial authorities, to volunteer local men for the war effort. In 1923, French became compulsory in New Caledonian schools, and the practices of indigenous medicine men were outlawed, with the threat of jail for anyone practicing wizardry. World War II brought new challenges, namely the prospect of a Japanese invasion. Initially under the control of a pro-Vichy government, which eventually forced out the nominally pro-Free French governor in late August 1940, New Caledonia would nevertheless soon emerge as an important base for the Allies in the South Pacific. This followed a bloodless coup by Governor Henry Satu of the New Hebrides, who aboard a Norwegian tanker and escorted by an Australian cruiser, arrived in Ouvéa that September. With overwhelming support from the populace in New Caledonia, he confronted the colony's pro-Vichy governor, demanding that he either come over to the side of the Free French or resign. He chose the latter. Satu immediately began piecing together a functioning government with considerable support from Australia, who feared the Japanese would take advantage of instability within the colony in order to gain control over its vast deposits of nickel and chrome. Unknown to anyone, while Japan certainly posed a threat, Vichy officials in French Indochina were then actively considering a plan to take back New Caledonia, thereafter offering Japan a much-needed supply of the previously mentioned alloys. In short, when the Japanese zone of action was sufficiently close to New Caledonia, the Vichy French would act. However, it never came to be. The U.S. military arrived on Grande Terre in 1942, along with a smaller number of Australians and New Zealanders. And the archipelago would serve as a strategic base for Allied operations against Japan, most notably in the Guadalcanal campaign. The conclusion of World War II saw the opening of a new chapter for New Caledonia. In 1946, it was no longer a colony, but rather a French overseas territory. This in turn ushered in further changes, and by 1953, French citizenship was granted to all New Caledonians, regardless of their ethnic origin. That same year, the Caledonian Union, a coalition party composed of Kanak and European peoples, was formed, which advocated for full self-governance in local affairs. The Union held a dominant position in the archipelago's political landscape for the next 2 decades, during which time considerable progress on self-governance was made, with the Territorial Assembly being created in 1957. However, in the 1970s, the party saw internal friction as many within its ranks began to flirt with the idea of total independence from France. It was around this time that another significant change occurred in New Caledonia too. Largely because of a nickel boom in 1969 to 72, a significant number of European and Polynesian immigrants had arrived, which meant, for the first time in their history, Melanesian people, such as the Kanak, had become a minority on New Caledonia, although they were still the largest single ethnic group in the archipelago. Following the independence of Fiji and Papua New Guinea, a number of new political groups formed in New Caledonia, pushing for more than the limited autonomy that the Caledonian Union spoke of. In 1979, the majority of Kanak parties, including the Union, united to form the Independence Front. Not sitting idle, those opposed to independence formed loyalist parties, the most well-known being the Rally for Caledonia, which later became the Rally for Caledonia in the Republic. RPCR was a Big Tent party, its primary focus being continued association with France. Sporadic fighting between French authorities and the Caldoche, a name given to the European inhabitants of New Caledonia and Kanak, occurred from 1976 to 1983. That year, roundtable talks were held in France, which ultimately resulted in the Le Monde Statute. This recognized the Kanak people's right to independence and granted enlarged autonomy in territorial affairs for a 5-year period, to be followed by a referendum in 1989. It, however, was rejected by the Independence Front, largely because of concerns about voter enfranchisement. Shortly thereafter, the bloc reorganized itself as the Kanak and Socialist National Liberation Front and boycotted the upcoming territorial election. FLNKS then seized control of an area outside Ouvéa, declaring the provisional government of Kanaky, presided over by Jean-Marie Gibau, a political leader within the Kanak independence movement. Seeking to avoid civil war, a referendum on independence and self-government in association with France was proposed in 1985. This was also rejected. Questions remained over who could or should vote in any potential referendum, with FLNK wanting eligible voters to consist only of Kanaks and those people who were born in the territory with at least one parent also of New Caledonian birth. A series of reforms ushered in a period of relative calm in the latter half of the 1980s. However, tension and violence continued to spread throughout New Caledonia. This culminated in the Ouvéa cave hostage-taking on the eve of presidential elections in 1988, in which Kanak separatists, armed with machetes, axes, and a handful of guns, killed 4 French soldiers, 2 of whom were unarmed, wounded 5 others, and seized 27 as hostages. The group was then marched to a 3-tiered cave on the island's remote northeast. Threatening to kill their hostages, the separatists demanded that regional elections be abandoned, and that a mediator be flown in from France to negotiate for a real referendum on self-determination under supervision of the United Nations. Negotiations were not especially productive, and at dawn the following day, French military and special forces launched their attack on the cave, killing 19 separatists. In addition, 2 French soldiers died in the ensuing battle. However, all hostages managed to escape unharmed after hiding in a part of the cave and defending themselves with a gun smuggled in during negotiations. FLNKS challenged the official narrative of events, and in a report by a GIGN leader, it was later claimed French troops were involved in extrajudicial executions of at least 3 separatists. This charge was investigated and denied by French military officials. Nonetheless, the event continues to be steeped in controversy, even today. The Ouvéa cave hostage-taking, however, marked an end to a decade-long period of violence in New Caledonia, a notable exception being the assassination of Jean-Marie Gibau by a Kanak extremist for his signing of the Matignon Accords. A new agreement between parties and the French government was then signed in Ouvéa in 1998, which laid out a 20-year transition period culminating in a referendum on independence. And this brings us full circle. New Caledonia had its first referendum on independence in 2018, with some 56% of voters rejecting independence. The second occurred in 2020, and a third final referendum is expected in 2022. Where New Caledonia goes from here is anyone's guess. Those in favor of remaining a French-administered territory point to the benefits derived from this relationship. China's expanding regional influence and geopolitical implications are also something to be considered. And while perhaps not disputing those benefits or implications, those in favor of New Caledonian independence see it as the ultimate goal of decolonization efforts. As I said at the very beginning of this episode, the question of independence and national identity continues to divide many in New Caledonia. Although, it's worth noting that a growing part of society has begun to simply refer to themselves as Caledonians, up 6% from the 2009 census. So maybe there's a not-so-divided future for New Caledonia somewhere down the line. Anyway, as always, thanks for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed it, please give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you again next time. Peace.